Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jillian Helding, and I'm the Vanderbilt Group's Outreach Manager. I'll be your facilitator and your slide guru today. So before we get started, I just want to share a quick couple of housekeeping items. The first of which is our presentation, as I'm sure you've seen, is going to last about 30 minutes. We will have time for questions at the end. So if you have questions during the course of the presentation, please use the Q&A box on your Zoom chat options down at the bottom. This is different from the regular chat box, so make sure you're clicking on the one that says Q&A. After the presentation concludes, we'll be sending everybody a copy of the PowerPoint and a summary of the results from the poll that we just had up. And a copy of the recording of the webinar is going to be available on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. The link for that is in the description, but you can also go to youtube.com/Vanderbilt Group. And then finally, if you have additional questions about procurement regulations or other aspects of grants oversight, you can either visit the resources page of our website, which is vanderbiltgroup.com/resources. And again, that link is in the chat box, or you can reach out to our presenter, Elizabeth Mackay, directly. Her email is also in the chat box. It's elizabeth@vanderbiltgroup.com. Now I'm going to take a minute to introduce Liz to all of you for anyone who doesn't know her. Liz is the Vanderbilt Group's Director of New Initiatives. She's a grants oversight, regulatory, procurement, and compliance expert. Before joining the firm, she spent 10 years as the Chief Legal Officer for the State of New Jersey's Division for Disaster Recovery and Mitigation. During her career in state government, she managed compliance for more than $10 billion in federal disaster recovery funds, including relief aid for Hurricanes Sandy and Ida and American Rescue Plan Act funds during the pandemic. Prior to that, Ms. Mackay served as the Deputy Director for New Jersey's Department of Consumer Affairs and a policy advisor to the Lieutenant Governor and Secretary of State. Mm-hmm. She's a graduate of the Columbia School of Law and a chartered financial analyst, also a former federal prosecutor for the Eastern District of New York, and a former Wall Street analyst, portfolio manager, and chief investment strategist for several major investment firms. We are incredibly lucky to have her as a member of our team and here today to share her expertise in the area of procurement, which I know she has a long and occasionally stressful history with. So with that, Liz, I will turn things over to you to walk us through our agenda in the beginning of the presentation.
That's great. Thank you, Jillian. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for participating today. And as Jillian mentioned, when I worked at the Division for Disaster Recovery and Mitigation in New Jersey, and that was part of the Department of Community Affairs, we were the grantee for HUD in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. That was a $4.2 billion grant. And then all the ARPA funds, which were over $6 billion. So in my role as the Chief Legal Officer, I handled all of the in-house procurements. I also was the state contract manager for an $80+ million contract. And I oversaw the monitoring unit for our subrecipients. Prior to joining that division, I worked at the Treasury, Department of the Treasury, where I worked in the division for purchase and property, which was the procurement arm of the state. So basically, I'm quite familiar with procurement rules. So if we look at our agenda for today, we're going to cover some of the basics of procurement, some of the key provisions in the uniform guidance, as well as some lesser known requirements. And not that they're not key provisions or not important, but these are more common pitfalls, I will say. And then we'll talk a little bit, where relevant, about the upcoming revisions to the uniform guidance as per the Office of Management and Budget. They came out with their final revisions to the 2 CFR sets of rules, which includes the uniform guidance, came out with that at the end of April, and those changes will take effect on October 1st. So again, where relevant, we'll touch a little bit on those. If you've listened to any of our prior webinars, you've heard me say that procurement rules are really the easiest rules to violate. And the most important goals of procurement for a government are competition, fairness, and transparency. And to serve those goals, the rules are very proscriptive and certainly not intuitive. And I think particularly if you're a private sector entity, it's very easy to overlook a step or, in fact, to misstep. So I mentioned the uniform guidance. What's the uniform guidance? Well, it's properly called the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. And this covers all federal grant awards. Now, we say uniform guidance to kind of telegraph the proper title, but that's a misnomer because this isn't guidance. These are requirements. There's no mistake about that. Okay, so if we look at what would be the typical flow of grant funds, so we have the federal agency that makes an award to a pass-through agency, which is often a state. And then the state, in turn, passes that award down to the eventual beneficiary, to a subrecipient. So the subrecipient can deploy the program or, in fact, can distribute the grant to another entity that would implement these funds. The pass-through entity, while it's a fairly simple name, entails quite a bit of responsibility because even though the pass-through entity doesn't retain the funding, it's responsible for the deployment of the funds. It's responsible for the implementation for the program that this grant is funding. And that means that it must monitor the subrecipients. So the federal government requires this monitoring to make sure that the subaward is used for the authorized purposes. Why was this award made? That it's in compliance with the federal statutes and regulations, and of course, the terms and conditions of that particular subaward. And then also that the subaward performance goals are achieved. Right? It's not just an audit. It's not just to make sure that the financials are eligible costs, but actually that the program is doing what it was supposed to do. Okay, so what is government procurement? It's a formal process in which the business is invited to bid for a contract for services or items. And in terms of some of the acronyms for competitive procurements, request for proposal, I'm sure you've heard, RFP. Blanket purchase agreement, BPA. That's another name for a request for proposal. In New Jersey, we call them blanket purchase agreements. A request for quote would apply more to construction than most other procurements because all it is the price, right? You have an engineering firm that has the specs laid out. You know what you have to do. What will we have to pay for you to do this? There's a request for qualifications, which is also called an RFQ. But that means we're trying to form a pool of firms that can perform a certain service. So there'll be a chance for you to show us what you can do, show us your capabilities. And then when usually an RFP is issued, then you are invited to bid for that RFP. So an RFQ is kind of an interim step. And then a request for information is basically to find out what do you offer? Or what are my alternatives with respect to procuring this service or this item? I'm not quite sure what firm should I go to procure this service. So I would issue an RFI, and again, that would be something that's probably followed by an RFP. So in terms of the general procurement standards, when there's two paths to take here. If you're a state, and after October 1st, because again, these revisions for the uniform guidance take effect on October 1st. After October 1st, tribal nations will also fall into this category. A state and then tribal nations must follow the same policies and procedures that they do for procurements from their non-federal funds. Now, for other non-federal entities that are not states or tribal nations, you must follow procurement procedures that are consistent with the state or local laws, tribal laws, and the standards of this section. Right, now, this section refers to the uniform guidance. So for all intents and purposes, if you're not a state and you're not a tribal nation, you have to follow the federal procurement standards. So when the value of the procurement exceeds the simplified acquisition threshold, and that's set by the federal government, it's currently $250,000, then you must use a formal procurement method. So what is a formal procurement method? First of all, your procedures are documented, and then the procurement would be publicly advertised unless a non-competitive procurement can be used. Now, it is very rare that you have a non-competitive procurement. If we look at some of the, according to the uniform guidance, these would be some of the reasons why you would not have a competitive procurement. So first of all, if the estimated value of the procurement does not exceed the micro purchase threshold of $50,000, and again, this is set by the federal government, it's currently $50,000. If the item is available only from a single source, which in practical terms, a single source is like a unicorn. There's always another company that could provide that service, or an item that's very similar, that's an alternate to the item at hand. Or if there's a public exigency or emergency that requires a procurement. And I had, again, I worked on the recovery from Hurricane Sandy. So Sandy caused tremendous infrastructure damage. We had treatment plants that were disabled, that were literally spewing raw sewage into waterways. We had over 8,000 homes that were, their residents could not live in them. We had other infrastructure damages. So we still had to have a competitive procurement. Now, it was a streamlined procurement. We used the GSA schedule and were able to gather some bids that way. But my point is, a public exigency apparently is a very high bar, because even with Hurricane Sandy, we did not meet that bar. And again, there were a few other waivers, if you will, on this slide. But again, it's extremely rare that you don't have a competitive procurement. Assume you will. Okay, so if we're going to go forward with an RFP, right, with our proposal, this is what you must include in your proposal, or how you must handle this RFP. First of all, again, you have to have this publicized. And if you're a state or if you're a private entity, publicizing it on your website, posting the procurement on your website satisfies this criteria. And as I always say, if you were not used to government procurement in the private sector and you hear about your award, your first impulse is to call your favorite vendor. And it's the wrong impulse. You can send the RFP to your favorite vendor, but you do that right after you post it on your website so that everyone can see this, because you cannot give a competitive advantage to one bidder over another. You have to have a written method for technical evaluations. So before you issue your RFP, you have to write down how this will be scored. You have to also form your evaluation committee. Who will be judging these proposals, and you have to make sure that they sign conflict of interest, to certify that there will not be a conflict of interest. The award is to the responsible offerer, in other words, a serious bidder, whose proposal is most advantageous, price and other factors considered. So in other words, there are technical factors that come into play here. It's not just price. You have to be able to show that you can actually do the job. Because if you have the lowest bid, the lowest price, but you don't demonstrate that you can get the job done, you don't have logical way to get this done, you will not get the award. You will not be awarded the contract. Okay, and if we look at the next slide, if we look at the another easy provision to overlook in the procurement process, a non-federal entity must perform a cost or price analysis. We call it price reasonableness, with every procurement action in excess of that simplified acquisition threshold of $250,000. That includes contract modifications. So for federal contracting, a change order that exceeds $250,000 must have an independent cost estimate. So even a contract change order is a big deal in the federal government. If you have a contract and you're going to extend the contract, you have to have a cost estimate for that extension. And it doesn't have to be a specific dollar amount, obviously, but if a bid comes in and it's within, at the state we used a 20% rule of thumb. If it's within that 20% rule of thumb, then it's fairly reasonable cost, and you can go ahead. Okay, very important, you must have documented procurement procedures. In real estate, we say location, location, location. In federal government regulations, it's document, document, document. So every step of your procurement process must be documented. Also, again, documentation. You must have a policy and procedures for employees who are involved in the procurement. So they have to, again, certify that they are not conflicted, and you have to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest. The procurement must be conducted in a manner providing full and open competition. And if you award a contract and it comes to light that you did not have a full and open competitive process, you will have to cancel that award and rebid the contract. Or on a worst case basis, you may even have to pay the money back to the federal entity. Hey, what are some practices that restrict competition? And I'm not going to go through all of these, but just to highlight a couple. Placing any kind of unreasonable requirements on a firm to qualify to do business is restricting competition. And I would say even a subcategory would be requiring unnecessary experience or excessive bonding. Obviously, that is going to cut back on your playing field. So that's anti-competitive. You cannot have bidders who are colluding either. Again, that is a non-competitive practice. And if you do specify a brand name, then you should say or equivalent. iPhone or equivalent instead of just iPhone. Okay, in terms of the conflict of interest issue or competitive advantage, if you develop draft specifications, requirements, statements of work, invitations for RFPs, if you're involved in the RFP, you cannot then compete for the contract. And I have an example that I always use where in the Sandy recovery, we had a shore town that had an engineering firm make up some draft specs for a flood mitigation project. Then that firm went and bid for the construction of that mitigation project, and they were awarded the contract. And to make matters worse, they were the sole bidder. So this was discovered. It went all the way up to HUD, and HUD demanded the money back. So not only did the town have to pay HUD back, pay that grant money back, but they had already contracted with this engineering company and they had to pay them. So you do not want to find yourself in that position. Yeah, there's a preference, a Buy America preference, and BABA is the Build America, Buy America Act. And what this says is that the greatest extent practicable, that if you have a construction project, that the raw materials you use should be sourced in America. Okay? And as this slide shows, it includes, but is not limited to, iron, aluminum, steel, cement, and other manufactured products. And these requirements flow down. So if there's a subaward or subcontract, that it would apply to those entities also. However, because we don't want this to be too simple, federal agencies may consider applying these requirements to for-profit entities, but OMB does not require them to do so. For example, the Department of Energy Grid Resilience Program Awards, if you're familiar with those, the grid resiliency programs, BABA does not apply to the direct beneficiaries of grant funds. Right? They are utility and industry grants that are made from the federal government directly to the energy company. In that case, BABA does not apply. But those requirements do flow down to subrecipients. So if we look at another Department of Energy program for the grid resiliency, the formula grants that pass through the states and tribal nations, in those cases, those pass-through entities have to comply with the Buy America Act, and therefore the energy company that receives the funding has to comply with the Buy America Act. So it depends on who distributes your funding. That would determine whether this applies or not. And just one other point on Buy America. Again, this is infrastructure, and it's the raw materials that go into the project. And it's for 55% or more of total cost. So it's not the complete project, 55% or more. And as such, it does not apply to scaffolding or the equipment that you use. It must be part of that actual infrastructure. Okay, some other goals, we'll say, a requirement for best efforts, we'll say. Right? Contracting with small and minority businesses, women's business enterprises, veteran-owned businesses, and labor surplus area firms. Now, veteran-owned businesses is in italics because as of October 1st, veteran-owned businesses will be part of this group. It's not right now. Okay, so according to the uniform guidance, non-federal entities must take all necessary affirmative steps to assure that small and minority businesses, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms are used when possible. Right? So the rule isn't that you must use these firms, you must hire these firms or subcontract to these firms. The rule is that you have to take these steps. You have to demonstrate best efforts. And we have a list of those. This is, again, according to the uniform guidance. You must place small minority businesses, woman-owned businesses on solicitation lists. They have to be able to receive your RFPs. Assuring such firms are solicited whenever they are potential sources. If you have a contract that would be suited to one of these firms, you might have to make sure that they receive that. Again, dividing requirements or establishing delivery schedules that may encourage their participation. And one thing that we did at the state to satisfy using the services and assistance as appropriate of organizations such as the SBA and the Minority Business Development Agency, when we had an RFP, we would send it to the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce and the African American Chamber of Commerce and ask them to please distribute this to their members who may qualify as primes or perhaps there'd be some subcontracting opportunities. Which leads me to the last item on the list, which is requiring the prime contractor if it's subcontracting, to take affirmative steps listed above. Okay, so I mentioned, again, October 1st, that we had some revisions to the uniform guidance, and these really aren't major changes to the procurement aspect, the procurement section of the uniform guidance. As of right now, geographic preferences are prohibited. That's considered an anti-competitive requirement. That will change on October 1st. And I think part of the reason is why, what you see on this slide. What the OMB is saying is that these agreements will not violate procurement standards. So whether it's a project labor agreement, you can require bidders to have commitments or goals to hire from disadvantaged communities. You can have agreements that are intended to ensure community benefits. And you can require that a bidder offer employees of a predecessor contractor the rights of first refusal under a new contract. You can require all of those things, as long as, importantly, they don't violate the Constitution and the Equal Protection Clause. If they don't violate the terms of the grant that you're issuing, or obviously state laws, local laws. So if you're familiar with the, again, Department of Energy grid resiliency grants, the GRIP grants actually have a requirement that you attach a community benefits plan with your application. So you're required to incorporate the Justice 40 initiative. You're required to engage the labor unions, the labor community, as well as leaders in the community at large. So that's a requirement for those programs. This isn't a requirement. These agreements are not required in the normal procurement process, but the OMB is saying you can do this. You can be very community focused, and again, make sure that you're satisfying the labor force. Okay, bonding requirements, and this is basically saying that you can take this on a situational basis, a fact basis, but at a minimum, and this is again in pretty much in construction contracts, you have to have a bid bond from a bidder that's equal to 5% of the bid price. They have to show that they're a real bidder. A performance bond is then executed when the contract is signed. And that performance bond is for 100% of the contract price. So that if the contractor skips town, you have enough money to make sure that this construction project is completed. And then a payment bond must be posted for 100% of the contract price. And that's to assure that payment for materials or payment for labor are there. So these, again, are the minimum requirements with respect to bonding for construction projects. Another provision that's somewhat easy to overlook is that before your award, you have to make sure that your awardee is registered in the System for Award Management, called SAM, with a unique identity identifier, unique entity identifier. Say that 3 times fast. But anyway, that is to make sure that the business is registered to do business with the federal government and that they haven't been suspended or debarred. And when you do this, you probably do this online, what you need to do is to get a screenshot. Remember, you have to document. Get a screenshot that shows that you actually conducted this check. And if you're a state entity, you want to make sure that this contractor isn't debarred from doing business with the state as well. In terms of monitoring past procurements, if you're a pass-through entity and you want to see your subrecipients' procurement records, this is what they must include. So you have to include a rationale for your method of procurement, the contract type, How was the contractor selected? When you put your score sheet in there, your evaluation committee minutes, and what was the basis for the contract price? And that's your independent cost estimate. Probably the first question, actually, if you're a pass-through entity and you're monitoring your subrecipient, is how was the procurement advertised? That's the threshold question. And then lastly, and again, this is one of these provisions that's I'm not sure people are really aware of. So for every contract, you've procured this contract successfully, you've met all the requirements. So as part of your contract, you have to include the provisions that you find in Appendix 2 of the Uniform Guidance. And some of those provisions are here. You have to guarantee that you will abide by the Equal Employment Opportunity Act. The contract has to have sanctions and penalties for breach of contract terms. The federal government isn't just putting its money out there, and if the contract defaults, it's just gone. So you have to have some kind of requirements, which you probably do anyway. And a few other provisions, the Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act. Remember that debarment and suspension check, Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirement, and then if it's applicable, again, if there's the flow down, it's the Buy America Act. What we would do is look at that Appendix 2, make a list of those provisions, put them all in one list, and then attach that to your contract as an addendum or appendix, exhibit, whatever your terminology. So again, this is not intuitive. This is procurement. Government procurement is a very complicated task, but the Vanderbilt Group is here to help you. And we have a list of the services that we offer. And in terms of the most relevant to what we've just talked about here, if you are a pass-through entity, you are responsible to monitor your subrecipient. And we can do that for you. You can hire us to monitor your subrecipient. Or if you'd like to form your own monitoring group, your monitoring team in-house, we can also help you to do that. We can help you to get that together. And then at the other end, if you are a private company and you are not familiar with federal grants regulations, we can help you by coming in with a grant readiness assessment, and we will help you set up your compliance. So there won't be a problem with course corrections down the road. We'll help you to establish the proper compliance mechanisms, set your operation up in compliance with the uniform guidance, et cetera. So we really are so appreciative that you participated today. Here's my contact information if you would like to hear more about our services, how we can help you. Also, if you have any questions about the presentation or this topic in general, or any grant oversight questions, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help you. I will respond. Again, as Jillian mentioned, you'll all receive a copy of this presentation. Thank you for answering our survey question. Again, that was so that we can design our services to help you. As I say, we are in business to keep you out of trouble. So again, thank you all for listening to us today.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Liz. We do have two questions here that I wanted to put out for you. So the first one we have, we actually just got another one. But the first one is, what if my state's procurement laws are different from federal laws? For example, if they're either more restrictive or not as strict, how do you determine whose procurement rules to follow?
Yeah, the general rule of thumb really for federal regulations is you go with the more restrictive, you go with the stricter rule. And I don't know if you noticed the slide that had the micro threshold is $50,000 for federal government. In New Jersey, the threshold, I believe it was $30,000. It was less than $50,000. So in that case, your rule would be $30,000.
So more restrictive, never less.
Yes.
All right. And then we have another question here. Is there a way that we can check whether or not a town is in good financial standing? For example, when determining if a project is high risk, we would like to check the credit history or assessment of the town. Is there a way to do this?
Yeah, the town should be, if the town has received any kind of federal funding, it has to have a single audit. So you can check the audit. They should be audited, and you can check that should be publicly available, and see if their auditor had any kind of findings in terms of their financials. Again, that should be publicly available information.
Liz, where would you go to find a copy of that single audit? Would it be this with the state?
I would say you would contact,
government?
if it's a municipality, you contact the municipal clerk.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And then our final question is, will we get to see the results of the survey from the beginning of the presentation? I'll take this one if you don't mind.
Sure.
So the answer is yes. We will send a summary of the survey results to each of you, along with a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. The results are anonymous. There won't be names on it or anything like that. We'll just show kind of numbers and percentages of people who selected yes for each item to give a sense of the trend overall. So thank you for asking. I believe that is all of our questions. I guess in that case, I will say to all of our attendees, thank you so much for being here.
Yes.
If you enjoyed the webinar and you'd like to share it with colleagues, again, we'll be passing along the PowerPoint and a recording. Will be going up on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. If you'd like to receive invitations to future webinars, you can either sign up for our mailing list on our website, which is vanderweelgroup.com, or you can keep an eye out for them on social media. We also tend to publicize them there. And with that, I will say thank you all again. Have a wonderful day and a great week.